Listen to your favorite shows live and on demand 24/7. Download the 77 WABC mobile app now. From Wall Street to the White House, this is the Larry Kudlow Show. Now, it's time for Protecting Your Investments, sponsored by Colonial Metals Group. Here's Larry Kudlow.
This is Protecting Your Investments, sponsored by Colonial Metals Group. Today, we're talking about protecting your investments in the stock market by keeping you informed. That's Colonial Metals Group. All right, let's do some money in politics. We got a lot to talk about. Liz Peek, Fox News contributor. Steve Moore, Committee to Unleash Prosperity Hotline and WABC radio host of More Money, following this show on many of these same stations. Steve Moore, you got something against Intel? Would you buy Intel and lose your shirt? I picked up the New York Post this morning, and your editorial's on the front cover. You do have a point. You know, I went and looked at the stock. Since Biden-Harris came to office in 2021, the stock is down two-thirds, and it was down almost 30% yesterday. And the government has given them, I added up your loans, your grants, and your tax credits. It's about $45 billion. And they still can't improve the share price. And they're still killing investors.
In government. Remember the CHIPS Act, Larry?
Yep.
Remember that one that was going to revitalize our semiconductor industry? Well, the price tag for that was somewhere around $300 billion, not million, 300 to 400. It was, in my estimation, the biggest corporate welfare bill in American history, and it was supposed to bring all these semiconductor jobs back from places like Taiwan and Singapore. And so we've given, it's hard to know, but some billions to Intel, and they're in a state of collapse right now. And the major company American company that makes semiconductors that is just blowing away the competition, of course, is NVIDIA. And you know how much money NVIDIA has taken from the CHIPS Act?
Zero.
I mean, I think it's an important story here, and I think it applies to all corporate welfare. It's just very similar to what's happened to the electric vehicle industry. As soon as the government gets involved in these industries and tries to tell them how to run their companies, and these companies think, boy, this is wonderful, we're going to get all this free government money, they collapse. And so we should get rid of all these corporate welfare programs. But this is probably the most vivid example that I can think of how dangerous these programs are.
Well, you know, this company's been faltering for many, many years since Andy Grove left. He was a genius that started it. Liz Peek knows about this, and he was a very smart guy. I tell the story, Liz, that the CEO of Intel used to come to my office in the White House and whine and beg for money. And they couldn't compete with China and this and that. And there were others. They were not the only ones. And we had a big battle internally in the Trump administration. I didn't want to give them a nickel. More moderates wanted $15 billion, and then some outliers, I won't mention any names, wanted much bigger. So Steve's right. It's a $300 billion bill, of which about $55 billion was direct aid to the chip industry. But the point is, private investment does it better. Right. All right? The money goes to the good, well-managed companies that have a good outlook. Government investment never does that. It was the same with the Solyndra companies, and it's the same with these EV companies, Liz. I mean, there's a lesson here that's bigger than Intel, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lesson that we never seem to learn because the government keeps doing it over and over again. You know, the three of us talked about that CHIPS Act when it passed. I was irate about it because here is one of the most profitable industries on earth. And why in the world are we giving them money? I mean, the whole thing was preposterous, particularly since most of the companies that were on the short list to get funding had already signaled that they were going to be building plants in the U.S. Why? Because building a plant in Taiwan, guess what? That seems just a tad risky when China is ever threatening Taiwan's security. And what could China do? They could impose a virtual embargo and stop exports out of Taiwan. So it wasn't like these companies needed to make needed help to decide to produce here. Yeah, they could have gone to a European country or something, but this was a really terrible idea from the get-go. And I have to say, a lot of Republicans signed on to it too. It's just like Republicans signing on to the infrastructure bill, because at some point, I guess, if you're a member of Congress, you feel like you have to be positive about something. But corporate engineering is a bad idea. And Larry, if you had a graph of the amount of influence the government has over private enterprise on one axis and growth on the other, there would be a very strong correlation showing the more the government puts its hand in the till and their foot on the neck of industry, the less growth you have. That is an absolute fact.
Well, Steve Moore, your pals in the National Conservative Movement should learn this, right? I mean, this is a perfect example of why these things fail.
No, that's exactly. You just read my mind, Larry. That's exactly what I was going to say. Is there is a big movement and a big debate on the economic side on the right, where you have these new national conservatives, and some of them are friends of mine. I just think they're a little misguided here, and they think that we need to spend tens and tens of billions of dollars, as you guys were just saying. And yet, it really does. It really does fail almost every time. I calculated the numbers on how much the U.S. government has spent on wind and solar power. Remember, this idea goes back to the late 70s when Jimmy Carter gave his famous speech saying, we can't use oil anymore. We're going to have to switch to wind and solar. And the numbers are astounding, like $500 billion we've given to this industry, and they're nowhere. We don't get any. We get a tiny fraction of our energy from wind and solar. The idea that we're some kind of energy transition, we're actually transitioning to natural gas, not the wind and solar. Right. And
by the way, that's a market.
Hands off of the stuff.
No, the move to natural gas is a market-based move because it's clean and it's efficient and it's relatively cheap. And we have lots of it. That's great.
And by the way, while the government is doling out money to wind and solar plants and companies on the one hand, on the other hand, they're totally restricting the ability to build like high tension electric wires, which actually get the power to the consumer. We're trying to do sort of half measures of government interfering and also doing carrots and sticks, but there is no overall plan or organization. So guess what, Larry? Private enterprise works better because they figure out these things ahead of time. Look at this ridiculous thing on the electric charging program. Tesla is building out charging stations. I'm surprised I don't have one in my backyard. They're everywhere. But the government has handed billions of dollars, Pete Buttigieg, billions of dollars to create some charging station to facilitate the switch to EVs. And guess what? They built 6 in 2 years. I mean, it's really staggering.
This is the second
front runner to be the vice president.
Right. This is the second time in this 3-hour show that somebody's mentioned Pete Buttigieg, which is the first time I've heard his name in years. But you're quite right. He's on the list for VP. How much fun would that be if Pete Buttigieg is out there and has to defend $8 billion to build 7 chargers? Man, that's just fabulous.
The 2 least productive members of the Biden White House, on the same ticket. I think that takes real talent.
Well, don't forget, though, to his credit, he does ride his bike to work.
Oh, yes. No, but somebody said when he goes to the White House meetings, he rides in the SUV with his Secret Service. Then when they're outside the gate, he gets out and gets the bike from the back and then rides the bike up West Exec. Okay, so it's not a real bike ride. It's an SUV Secret Service bike ride. Okay. So that brings me to the front edge of a recession based on all these lousy numbers, unemployment, jobs, falling ISM, manufacturing, consumer sentiment, and so forth. Kamala's, look, let's assume, all right, just as a thought experiment, that a recession begins later this year and goes well into 2025. The question becomes, what would Kamala Harris do and what would Donald Trump do? I mean, I think that's a very important question, and it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different. it's not just about inflation anymore because we have a significant recession threat. So I'm going to begin with Liz because Liz writes, what does Kamala Harris really stand for in The Hill and her other publications? So what would her recession-fighting plan look like, Liz Peek?
She would want another big stimulus program, Larry. You can count on it. Whereas Trump would go for lower taxes, lighter regulation, encouraging consumption, and maybe more importantly, encouraging investment. I'm sure Kamala Harris would hearken back to the Obama period where they spent $800+ billion on economic stimulus. And the problem we have with that is I think you'd see interest rates go through the roof because people are very concerned already about our enormous deficits, and this would promote even worse deficits. And that is why, folks, you don't get into this situation, why it's dangerous when unemployment is under 4% to keep rolling out federal programs that basically end up with deficits of $2 trillion a year. We couldn't afford it. And, going forward, I think she'd have a very hard time getting Congress to sign off on new big spending programs, but that would be her inclination.
Well, I think that it's an interesting point because I'm going to disagree a little bit. Interest rates are going to crash in a recession. We got a taste of that this past week and yesterday.
Well, inflation's coming down big time. You look at the commodities; they're crashing.
Yeah.
The only time, rates go up during recoveries; they come down during recessions, unless you're in a double-digit inflation situation, but which we are not. So, actually, you know what? Let me take a break here because I want to dig in some more, and Steve's going to respond as well to this whole story. So, Liz Peek, Fox News contributor, Steve Moore's WABC radio host of More Money, which comes right after this show on many of these very same stations. I'm Kudlow. We'll be right back.
Larry Kudlow. From Wall Street to the White House, this is the Larry Kudlow Show.
Welcome back. We're talking to Liz Peek and Steve Moore, Money and Politics. Steve Moore, what would Trump do in a recession? Hello?
So, was that for me, Larry?
Yeah.
Was the question, are we going into a recession, or
no.
what do we do to stay out of it?
What would a Trump policy be in a recession?
Well, first of all, Trump created an economic boom the first time around, and so more of the same. You drill, baby, drill. You take away the most harmful regulations. You promote a more sane tax system that keeps those tax reductions permanent. And you just have – look, Trump is pro-business. Kamala is anti-business. It's that simple. You can't have a business recovery when you have someone who believes that the businesses should be the dartboard. And so I think everybody knows that. If you look at every single poll, 2-to-1 margins, people understand that Trump is better for the economy than Biden or Kamala Harris. Now, if it's Trump said this very well. Look, if people go to the polls and vote on abortion, Trump is going to lose. If they go and vote on issues like how do I keep my job, how do I keep my 401k plan, everyone knows Trump is better.
He's got a good, very interesting. He wants to stop the taxation of Social Security benefits for retirees. So,
Can I just say one quick thing about that, Larry? I was just looking at the numbers, and I don't know if Trump knew this when he came out with his proposal, but if you're in your, say, mid-60s to late 60s and you continue to work because you collect Social Security, you're facing a marginal tax rate on each additional dollar that you make when you include the benefits you lose of 60-70%. The highest tax rates on working in the country are on senior citizens.
So here's the way out of that, and it's way out of the revenue problem too. Talking to Kevin Hassett and Michael Faulkner, inflation index the threshold. So in 1983, this was part of the Reagan Social Security fix, the Greenspan Commission. The threshold was $25,000. And that has been maintained for the last 40 years, okay?
Ridiculous.
Now, if you use a consumer price index, what happens is the threshold goes from $25,000 to $80,000.
Yeah, right.
Okay?
Right.
So the percentage of people paying, retirees paying would go way down again. Originally, it was only 10%. but because the threshold hasn't moved in 40 years. This would take care. First of all, it becomes a middle-class tax cut at an $80,000 threshold. And second of all, the revenue loss would be minimal. And actually, when you realize it's a tax on employment, you might actually, make money on it or something. Yeah. That, to me, Liz, I say that's both of you. That's the best way to deal with the Social Security. Yeah. You get into the earnings test, it's too bloody complicated. And it's mostly an upper income thing, but this would restore it as a middle class tax cut, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that would be an unbelievably popular proposal, Larry. There are an awful lot of seniors for whom Medicare and Social Security are life affirming. That's what they live on, and the way it's taxed now, they really can barely live on it. So I think it's a great idea. If it can figure out that it will be mostly marginal neutral, that would be incredible. Can I go back to my comment earlier about interest rates going up? If Congressman, my issue is the bond vigilantes or whatever you talk about. I just don't think you can keep funneling these kinds of gigantic loads onto the debt markets and not have a reaction at some point. I may be totally wrong, but at some point, there's a cost to this, and
in a recession, rates are going to fall. They're just going to fall. Trust me.
I'm sure that
always happens. You borrow more because what happens is tax revenues go down and spending goes up. It's automatic stabilizers.
True.
But I do agree with your other point. However, people are sick of $2 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see, and if Kamala thinks she's going to go and do another $2 trillion every year, the way Biden did with his $1.9 trillion, so forth, there will be resistance to it. Let's assume the Republicans take the Senate. There'll be a lot of resistance to that. Spend the money on tax cuts, for heaven's sakes, right? Let people keep more of their own money. Spend the money on helping Social Security retirees or, people in Las Vegas who make tips. Spend the money there. Then it'll have a good yield. People will work harder, and there'll be more investments, and you'll keep more of what you earn after tax. That's all.
Yeah. Well, this is why
it certainly works better than government directing the money. That's for sure.
Why give Intel another $45 billion? Unless Steve owns the stock. I don't know if he owns the stock or not.
I'm glad I don't. But, I want to go back just for a minute to this issue of the Social Security taxation, because I was on Fox this morning.
Yeah.
And I said, look, one of the benefits of this is we will reward seniors who work longer. And I made the point, and this is something Larry, because you talk a lot about this, work is pro-health. The longer you work, retiring at an early age is associated with an earlier death rate than people who continue to work. And so we need people to work longer. And the left attacked me this morning. Oh, Trump advisor says that we have to force people to work beyond the 65. That's not what I was saying. I was saying if people want to work and they're healthy and they want to continue to do productive things, let's not punish them.
Democrats want to pay you not to work. Okay? Exactly. Whatever Kamala says, she is in favor of a guaranteed basic income, okay? And wait for it, nationalized health care, which was priced out at $32 trillion. I don't care what she says. Just like fracking. I don't care what she says. The Biden-Harris policy in the last 3.5 years has basically to ban fracking. They've tried their damnedest, right?
That's what net zero is.
Yes, that's right. Thank you.
And ban LNG exports, which is possibly the stupidest thing they've done in 3.5 years, because it totally enables Russia, Iran, all the other people who are going to be exporting LNG to make up for our shortfall. It's really an unbelievable thing. Words fail me in terms of the idiocy of that particular issue, and she's totally on board with that.
Let's go back to the vice presidential race. Who are you looking for, Steve Moore? Who's going to be her Veep?
It's going to be the Pennsylvania governor, and he is going to – I don't know a whole lot about him except that he completely flip-flopped on school choice. But the Democrats cannot win without Pennsylvania, and so it will be Shapiro.
Interesting. Liz, you agree with that?
It certainly seems that way. My only reservation is I think that sets up a real battle with progressives in her party. They don't want it. The fact that he's Jewish is a real red flag for them, and a lot of them have vocally resisted it already. So you may win Pennsylvania. You could end up losing Michigan.
Not Buttigieg, because that would be so much fun.
He wouldn't. Yeah. who knows how that spins the dial. I don't think he's a real contender. I think his record of completely ineptness in the White House dooms his potential. But I don't know. I mean, it takes one to know one, maybe.
Steve Moore, the Pennsylvania governor, I thought he was for school choice. Last 20 seconds.
Yeah, he was for it before he was against it. He vetoed the bill that would have provided.
Oh.
Well, I know we're coming on. I want to make one last suggestion.
Real fast.
Please get Kamala Harris on your show. And what I want you to do when you get her on your show is ask her what is fracking.
Oh, I was going to ask her how to pronounce her name. That's the hardest one. Liz Peek, thank you. Steve Moore, thank you. I'm Kudlow. We'll be back next weekend. Thanks, everybody.